Bibliophiles of the internet, today I'm here to share my final recap for what I read during the recovery process, and today is all about my favorite books I read in June. I went a bit buck wild in June, I have to be completely honest. I think I knew my recovery period was coming to an end, and because I anticipated a slowdown in my reading once I got back into work, content creation, all that stuff, I just read my heart out and somehow read 22 books. It was also Pride Month, and the Queer Lit Readathon was going on for the entire month, and I just always have a shit ton of queer books to read, and I think it speaks volumes that I read 22 of them, and that was just barely scratching the surface. Actually, I think one of them might not have been queer, I'm not entirely sure. Either way, let's go through these. I read Pilar Ramirez and the Curse of San Zenon by Julian Randall, The Bayou by Arden Powell, Lucky Red by Claudia Cravens, Mortal Follies by Alexis Hall, Where the Lost Ones Go by Akemi Dawn Bowman, Translation State by Anne Leckie, You Don't Have a Shot by Raquel Marie, Our Hideous Progeny by C.E. McGill, Nikhil Out Loud by Malik Pancholi, Open Throat by Henry Hoke, Page Boy by Elliot Page, Counting Casualties by Yoon Ha Lee, Princess Floralinda and the 40 Flight Tower by Tamsin Muir, Unmasked by the Marquess, A Duke in Disguise, and A Delicate Deception by Kat Sebastian, A Song of Salvation by Alicia Dow, Ode to My First Car by Robin Gao, He Who Drowned the World by Shelley Parker Chan, We Could Be So Good by Kat Sebastian, Mammoths at the Gate by Nivo, and A Marvelous Light by Freya Marsky. It was quite a month, to put it lightly, and then as a Libra, it was a deep moral quandary to then have to choose only a handful of favorites out of all of these fantastic books. Also, before I forget, I did want to mention that I read Julian Randall and Akemi Dawn Bowman's middle grade books because I moderated a panel for QPOC Fest, which I will link down below in case you want to watch the replay. And also, Counting Casualties by Yoon Ha Lee is a short story that's available to read for free on Tor.com, like the website, not the imprint, so I will link that down below as well. Again, cannot emphasize enough how difficult it was to choose just 6 favorites from this batch, but we're just gonna bite the bullet and dive right in. Starting with Lucky Red by Claudia Cravens, which came out on June 6th, but I listened to the audiobook read by Elena Ray, courtesy of Penguin Random House Audio. Lucky Red is a queer historical western. It's about a young girl named Bridget whose father is killed when they're crossing the Kansas prairie. So now she has only herself to depend on, and she finds this woman-owned brothel, and the girls there take her in and offer her work. So she's doing that, trying to find her footing, and then this legendary female gunslinger rides into town, and Bridget falls for her fast, even though this affair between them might leave nothing but destruction in its wake. Content warnings for alcoholism and child neglect, parental death and grief, physical assault, injury, violence, and gun violence, and some descriptions of sex work and explicit sexual content. This book is fucking amazing. It is, in my opinion, a perfectly paced, meticulously crafted, slow-boiling, epic tale of revenge. And that journey from relative innocence to hardened, bloodthirsty vengeance is so delicious. I love how the story explores brothel life, the community or lack thereof that exists between the girls. I love that it's a coming-of-age, coming-into-queerness story for Bridget. I love the forbidden romance, the dangerous outlaws, the gender-defiant criminals, the betrayal, the action, the suspense, all of it. But I also love how every single detail in this story matters. And you may hear me say that and think, isn't that a given? And technically yes, but also no. In terms of craft, a scene should never just be something happening. It should advance the plot, it should reveal something about the characters, it should establish atmosphere or the rules of the world, it should introduce a complication, it should do something. But that's not always the case, and I was blown away by how every little detail in this story added up to something greater, foreshadowed something, introduced characters or places that would serve a greater purpose later in the story. It's like adding one grain of sand to a pile at a time, and at first you can't tell the difference, but then suddenly you have a mountain. I think what I'm getting at here is that the payoff of the story is so incredibly satisfying, not only in terms of action, because it's all building towards this classically Western epic showdown, but also in terms of Bridget's character, the way she's torn between self-preservation and pushing herself to be something more than just someone who survives. She's realizing that all the people and institutions she's ever put her faith in or been loyal to are not loyal back to her, which is devastating. She's learning how easily the world can turn its back on you, especially when you're seen as disposable, and that's why she wants to take her own fate into her hands. It's incredible, it's well written, it keeps you guessing until the very end. I loved every single thing about it. No notes, audiobook was fantastic as well. This was a huge 5 stars. Next I have to talk about Our Hideous Progeny by C.E. McGill. This is queer historical science fiction. It's been billed as a reimagining of Frankenstein, but I think it's more of a continuation because it follows Mary, who is Victor Frankenstein's great niece, and she's also a scientist, although although because she's a woman, she's relegated to being her husband's assistant. But the thing is, in order to have standing within the scientific community, you need to be a person of means, which Mary and her husband are very much not. So no one takes them seriously, and when they reach a real low point, that's when Mary discovers her great uncle's research and decides to improve upon it with a creature of her own creation. Content warnings for references to parental death and infant death, explorations of grief, instances of racism, classism, and sexism, descriptions of chronic illness and experiences of ableism, imagery relating to animal death and experimentation, and some instances of injury and violence. I want to yell about this book from the rooftops. It hits that sweet spot where queer self-discovery, feminism, social commentary, and historical Jurassic Park-like aesthetics meet, and I am wild about that very specific intersection. This is the perfect example of how fiction can pay homage to classic stories while still managing to be refreshing, original, and innovative in really exciting ways. This spiritual sequel of sorts is drawing upon the same thematic principles as the original. It's a story about ambition, hubris, discovery, creation, and destruction, but it is firmly rooted in female rage and otherness. It's not just about creating a quote-unquote monster, but also how society construes Mary as being monstrous herself, because she's married and without children, because she's secretly queer, because she's a woman in a man's profession, because she's prideful and self-aware and all these other things. In some ways, society views her as being every bit as unnatural as the very creature that she creates and resurrects. It's about how so much of her life and herself is relegated to the shadows, conducted behind closed doors, never to see the light of day, and how that violently clashes with this all-too-human urge to be seen and validated in our choices. As the story builds towards its horrific crescendo, we see Mary creating and protecting a version of life, both her own and the creature's, that's every bit as fragile as it is improbable, that some would say is impossible to understand or accept, and hoping against hope that it will not be destroyed in a world that could never anticipate its existence. Every aspect of the story is perfectly considered. The way it puts child loss, queerness, experimentation, and ungodly ambition in conversation with each other just absolutely blows my mind. Not enough people have read this one. Please pick it up. It was a very clear 5 stars. Also, shout out to Megan from Books and Blazers for the incredible recommendation. She was absolutely 100% correct. We really are just going through the greatest hits, because next we have Unmasked by the Marquess by Cat Sebastian, and I listened to the audiobook read by Joel Leslie. This is the first book in the Regency Imposters Companion series. It's about Alistair, the Marquess of Pembroke, who's dedicated himself to repairing the estate and family funds that his father almost completely destroyed. That is his biggest point of pride. That's his one and only focus. Enter Robert Selby, who's determined to make his sister an advantageous match, which is why he tries to infiltrate Alistair's social circles so he can leverage Alistair as a wealthy benefactor, because Robert Selby is actually a penniless housemaid named Charity Church. Content warnings for familial death and grief, some instances of sexism and misgendering, as well as explicit sexual content. Also, Charity's chosen name is Robin, which is how I'm going to refer to her for this entire review, and it's important to note that Robin is canonically non-binary, trans-masc leaning, and she does use she/her pronouns. This romance, it broke me, it healed me, it did so many things in the best way possible. It is so unabashedly, unapologetically queer, and it's just such a refreshing twist on the typical kind of romance that tends to dominate this time period. It's so much fun to watch these two fall in love, especially on Alistair's side of things, because he's immediately drawn to Robin. He loves spending time with her, reading to her, hearing her laugh, and keep in mind this is when he thinks that Robin's a man, and he's like, yes, these are all extremely heterosexual things that everyone does with their pals. I also love the dynamic between Robin and Alistair because they both feel bound to their sense of duty. They both want to provide for their family and protect their family, and even though they're sort of aligned morally in that sense, this masquerading scheme sometimes puts those desires in conflict. Alistair, like I said, is very focused on repairing his family's estate and reputation, so he's very hung up on his image and the way his peers in high society view him, which is why he's hesitant to take up with Robin, because he's afraid that other people will see their relationship as shameful or scandalous. He is absolutely working through that as the story progresses, and what I love is that Robin is challenging those ideas, and she refuses to take on that shame as her own because it's not. She fully understands that that shame belongs to Alistair. It's his problem to work through because she knows exactly who she is and she's not going to change herself or pretend to be something she's not, meaning a woman, just because it would make things easier. So they're both very stubborn, very righteous people, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes not, and so it's interesting to see how they have to navigate this relationship in a way that will allow both of them to fully be themselves. It's really about how they have to reframe their values and their concepts of duty to carve out that future for themselves. They definitely go through it, face some challenges, question everything they know, but when they finally end up where they want to be, it is so incredibly rewarding. And as per Cat Sebastian's usual, the story is funny, it's sexy, it's earnest, and achingly romantic. Obviously, this was 5 stars. Next up, we have The Absolute Beast that is He Who Drowned the World by Shelley Parker Chan. This comes out on August 22nd, and I was very kindly sent a review copy by Tor Books. This is the sequel and conclusion to She Who Became the Sun. I don't think I can say much about what's happening in this second book, but in general, this duology is set in China during the 1300s amidst the war against the Mongol overlords. It's basically putting a queer, semi-fantastical twist on the Red Turban Rebellion. We're following a non-binary character named Chu who decided to take her brother's name when he died as a child, as well as his fate to become this legendary figure in history. So the story is really about her rise to power when she decides that she doesn't want to simply survive, but she wants to be great. Content warnings for graphic injury, dismemberment, and violence, death, and grief, instances of graphic self-harm and assisted self-harm, homophobic slurs, some instances of domestic and sexual abuse, references to miscarriage, and some explicit sexual content. Let me just start by answering the question that's on everyone's mind. Does this second book, does this series conclusion stick the landing? Yes, it abso-fucking-lutely does. Epic historical fantasy truly is the best descriptor for this duology. By the time you get to the end of each book, you feel like you've lived entire lifetimes with these characters, but there's these incredibly distinctive, unforgettable adventures and gambits that very clearly punctuate those large swaths of time. I feel like for some people, lengthy, epic historical fantasy might be a hard sell, but both books in this duology feel incredibly accessible. They're very grounded in these human needs and ambitions. You always know what the characters want, what they're feeling, what they're trying to accomplish, and there's never a moment where you're not completely on edge. Even in the quieter moments, there's always something happening beneath the surface. And I think in this book especially, there are so many different camps now vying for power, vying for the throne. There's so much at stake for everyone involved, and even the smallest choices that all of these players make result in a complete reshuffling of the board. And I think what makes this series resonate for me is the fact that power in this story is never just power. It's not about political power, it's not about fame or riches or palaces. It's about how power means different things to the different characters, whether that's revenge, agency, visibility, validation, justice, or respect. Obviously, Chu is an incredibly compelling character to follow. She has this unwavering belief in herself and her destiny, but what really endears you to this character who might otherwise be read as power-hungry is the fact that the power she's fighting for is so much bigger than just the throne. She's fighting for the power to remake the world into one where people like her can exist, where people can decide who they want to be for themselves. And while I just described her belief in herself as unwavering, I think that's what's interesting about this second book, is that she actually is questioning herself. She and all the other players are having to ask themselves how far they're willing to go, how much they're willing to sacrifice, how many people they're willing to hurt in order to get what they want. And if they get what they want, will the price they paid have been worth it? There's action, epic battles, subterfuge and deception, unlikely allies, political and interpersonal drama at the absolute highest level imaginable. But it's also an in-depth exploration of the difference between obligation and free will, and how belief can only be as strong as the actions and choices that uphold it. There's so much I want to say about this book, and I know I'm not doing it justice. It is difficult to read at times, definitely a lot of self-harm, so please tread carefully with that, but the payoff is so much greater than I could have hoped for. This was, without a question, 5 stars. Next, I could not make this video without talking about We Could Be So Good by Cat Sebastian. I actually did a hybrid read of this with the audiobook, which is once again read by the incredible Joel Leslie, and I was gifted a finished copy by Avon Books. Listen, I debated whether I should talk about 2 Cat Sebastian books in this format, but she truly deserves every ounce of recognition. That is just how good she is. This is queer historical fiction, of course, set in 1950s New York. It is not Rivals to Lovers romance, but the premise is that these 2 characters should theoretically theoretically have been rivals, but instead they accidentally become the bestest of friends. So it's about these two reporters, Nick and Andy. Nick is this rough and ready, by-the-book sort of journalist who's worked his way up from the bottom, and Andy's actually the son of the newspaper publisher whose father gives him this reporting job so he can start learning the ropes to eventually take over the company. So Nick's like, damn, I really should resent this absolute disaster human who was just handed a job I've worked my entire life for. But that lasts all of 2 seconds before they become best friends and eventually roommates, and then they have to figure out if and how their friendship could translate to a romance. Content warnings for homophobia and homophobic slurs, brief allusions to bullying, child abuse, and child neglect, some depictions of anxiety, references to parental death and grief, and some explicit sexual content. Also worth noting, Nick is gay, Andy is bisexual, both of them are anxious, and Andy is definitely undiagnosed neurodivergent, most likely ADHD if I had to guess. This might be the most fun I've had reading something in such a long time, which is a wild thing to say in a month where I read 3 other Cat Sebastian books that were also a very good time. But this one really takes the cake. This book had me laughing out loud, kicking my feet like a little schoolgirl, absolutely live, laugh, loving to the highest degree possible. It was fantastic. First of all, this isn't just friends to lovers, it's like bestest friends forever and ever and ever to lovers. It is so pure, it is so soft, it is so wholesome, and it's like the most decadent, molecular level slow burn romance. It's the kind of slow burn where the second one of the characters even thinks about making a move, the other one literally flees the state. I need you to let that sink in. Flees the state. But the friendship between these characters is so beautiful. This is very much a character-driven story, not so much a plot-driven story, and that really works because these two have such an incredible connection. They know each other better than they know themselves, and it's just such a delightfully domestic story where these two people are very deliberately making space for each other in their lives in more ways than one. So the relationship really is the story, and I think that makes a lot of sense because these are two very lonely characters who have been forced to rely only on themselves for so long in so many ways. Nick is not only from this rough Brooklyn neighborhood where he went through a lot growing up, but also as a more experienced gay man, he knows every part of his life would be in danger if the wrong person discovers his queerness. Andy, on the other hand, grew up very estranged from both his parents. It's almost traumatized him to the point where he's terrified of being alone. So to have found this incredibly thoughtful, attentive, caring kind of companionship is something he views as extremely precious. So yes, the story is hilarious, it's tropey, it's full of domestic shenanigans, and it's super fun to read. But there's also this other layer about these being two people who have been taught to believe that loving them is too much work, that it's too much of a sacrifice to expect people to love them and to stay, that they will always be the person who gets left behind. So it's really about them overcoming that together, learning how to love each other and themselves honestly and fiercely, to be generous in the way they share themselves with each other, and to realize that the future they want together can exist only if they choose to make it. It's so common for romances especially to sort of relegate friendship to a lower level of connection, or sort of position it as a stepping stone that's just the first arbitrary point on the path towards romance. But here, the love that Nick and Andy share as friends is every bit as passionate as their romance. The romance between them exists because and in service of their friendship, first and foremost, and the story never once loses sight of that. This book is just wonderful. It's funny as fuck, heartfelt, achingly earnest and sincere. It made me cry tears of joy at some points. I can't do it physically right now, but I am coming to you on hands and knees, begging you to read We Could Be So Good and just accept love and happiness into your life. 5 stars. Clearly, I have very normal feelings about this. Lastly, I want to quickly talk about Mammoths at the Gates by Nivo, which comes out on September 12th, and I was gifted a review copy by Tor.com. This is the 4th novella in the Singing Hills Cycle series. It's a series of folkloric fantasy stories centered around this non-binary cleric named Cleric Chi, whose job as a cleric is to collect stories to be preserved and archived for future generations. This installment is about Cleric Chi returning to the Abbey for the first time in years, only to find out that their mentor has passed away, and there are these mammoth-riding warriors at the gates attempting to lay claim to this cleric's body. Content warnings for some instances of misgendering as well as explorations of death and grief. I've said this before, but what I love about this series of novellas is that each installment is gradually building out the world and the characters in really compelling ways. Each one is a different take on the concept of stories within stories and also the different functions that storytelling can serve. The first one is about storytelling as a means to combat erasure. The second one is about stories as cultural exchange. The third one is about storytelling as a means of understanding landscape. And this one is about storytelling as memory and storytelling as ceremony in a lot of different ways. Especially with that element of grief that's overlaying everything in this installment, there really is that focus of stories as a means of remembering those who have passed, showing respect for them and their lives, and also understanding how the world is reshaping itself around their loss. I think it's also about how the legacy of one person's life can never be boiled down to a single story or a single narrative. It's about how we contain multitudes and change constantly alongside an ever-changing world. So how do we honor that fluidity, that unending potential of one person's life in our grief, which tends to flatten things? So I loved everything about this. I think it ties When the Tiger Came Down the Mountain for my favorite installment in this series so far. The story has homecoming, wayward spirits, political and cultural tension, and even some surprises. I loved it. 5 stars. I'm not even going to apologize that all the books in this video except the last one were historical fiction and that they were also all 5 stars. That should give you a really clear picture of just how incredible my reading month was. So those are just a handful of standout books I read in June. Let me know if you read them or any of the other books I mentioned in this video, what you thought of them, if you're adding them to your TBR. Let's discuss all the things down below in the comments. But that's everything I had to share for today. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.